The boy couldn't have been more than 7 years old. April 12, 1945. The small town of Herzberg, 60 miles south of Berlin. He stood in the rubble of what had been his neighborhood, his clothes too big for his shrinking frame, his eyes hollow with a kind of hunger that went beyond food. For 3 years, maybe 4, he'd been told the Americans were monsters. Devils who ate children. Barbarians who would destroy everything German, everything good, everything his father had died defending on the Eastern Front. The propaganda posters on every standing wall showed American soldiers as guerrillas, fang beasts, destroyers of civilization. Now one of them was walking toward him. Private First Class Joseph Madden from Brooklyn was 19 years old, tired, dirty, and had been in combat for 43 straight days. He'd helped liberate 2 concentration camps. He'd seen things that would wake him at night for the next 60 years. But when he saw the boy standing alone in the ruins, something in him, maybe the part that remembered being 7, remembered his own little brother back home, made him stop. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a Hershey bar, the last one from his K-ration. The boy stepped back. His mother had warned him. His teachers had warned him. The Hitler Youth leader had made them all swear an oath, never take anything from the Americans. They put poison in food. They drugged children. They were the enemy of everything German. But the boy hadn't eaten chocolate in 2 years. Hadn't eaten much of anything in 2 weeks. The American soldier set the chocolate on a broken piece of wall between them and stepped back, hands visible, trying to smile though he was too exhausted to make it reach his eyes. What happened next would be repeated 10 million times across Germany in the spring of 1945, in 10 million small variations, each one driving another crack through 12 years of Nazi propaganda. The boy took the chocolate. He bit into it. And in that moment, tasting sweetness after years of sawdust bread and turnip soup, something broke inside him. Not his spirit, that had been breaking for months, but his belief. The monster who was supposed to eat him had fed him instead. The devil had given him chocolate. Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel. Joseph Goebbels had spent 12 years building the most sophisticated propaganda machine in human history. By 1945, every German child could recite the Catechism of Hate. Americans were uncultured barbarians controlled by Jews, interested only in destroying German culture, raping German women, enslaving German children. The propaganda was everywhere, in schools where children sang songs about American monsters, in newspapers that reported fictional American atrocities, in films that showed American soldiers as subhuman beasts, in radio broadcasts that warned of the terror that would follow American occupation. The propaganda had been particularly focused on children. They were the future of the Thousand-Year Reich, and their minds had to be shaped from birth. Picture books showed American bombers piloted by grinning skeletons. School lessons included mathematics problems about calculating bomb damage from American raids. Children's songs had verses about brave German soldiers protecting them from American devils. By 1945, there wasn't a child in Germany who hadn't been thoroughly indoctrinated to fear and hate Americans with every fiber of their being. But propaganda, Goebbels had always known, worked best when it couldn't be tested against reality. It thrived in the abstract, in the theoretical, in the distant enemy who remained faceless. What he hadn't calculated, what perhaps he couldn't have calculated, was what would happen when millions of American soldiers, young men barely out of their teens, met millions of German children face to face. And what would happen when those young men, products of an abundant society, carried in their pockets the small miracles of American prosperity, chocolate bars, chewing gum, lifesavers, Tootsie Rolls. The first reports reached Nazi leadership in September 1944, as American forces entered German territory. A Wehrmacht intelligence officer near Aachen noted with alarm, "American soldiers are distributing candy to German children. This is having an unexpected impact on civilian morale. Children are actively seeking contact with enemy forces. Recommend immediate countermeasures." The countermeasures were swift and harsh. Parents were warned that American candy was poisoned. Children caught accepting food from Americans would be considered traitors. The Hitler Youth was mobilized to monitor and report any child who took American gifts. But hunger is stronger than ideology, and chocolate is more persuasive than propaganda. 8-year-old Ingrid Hoffman, interviewed 50 years later, remembered her first encounter with Americans in April 1945. "We had been told they would kill us. My mother had hidden my sister and me in the cellar when we heard the tanks coming. But then we heard laughter. Children's laughter. We crept up to look, and saw American soldiers sitting on their tanks, throwing candy to a crowd of children. I had never seen so much chocolate. My mother tried to hold me back, but I broke free and ran. A soldier gave me an entire pack of chewing gum. Chewing gum! I had only heard of it in stories. I chewed one piece for hours, until my jaw hurt, afraid it would be the last sweet thing I'd ever taste." The impact was immediate and profound. German children who had been taught to see Americans as monsters saw them instead as sources of unimaginable plenty. The same hands that operated weapons of war held out gifts of sweetness. The contrast with their own experience of deprivation was shocking. German soldiers hadn't had chocolate to give out for years. The Nazi state that claimed to be protecting them couldn't provide basic food, while these supposed barbarians carried candy in their pockets like it was nothing. Staff Sergeant Robert Williams from Alabama wrote to his mother in May 1945. "The children here break my heart. They're so skinny, so scared, but also so eager for any kindness. I gave a little girl a piece of chocolate yesterday and she started crying. Her mother told me through an interpreter that it was the first chocolate she'd had since 1942. How do you fight children? How do you stay hard when a pack of gum makes them look at you like you're Santa Claus? We're supposed to be occupying this place, but honestly, I spend most of my time feeling like I want to feed every kid I see." The Nazi propaganda machine tried desperately to counter this. Radio broadcasts warned of American soldiers using candy to lure children for nefarious purposes. Newspapers ran stories of poisoned chocolate, drugged chewing gum, candy laced with substances that would make German children sterile. But the children who ate the chocolate didn't die. They didn't get sick. They got happy. And happiness, in the rubble of the Third Reich, was the most subversive force imaginable. The process was gradual but inexorable. A child would take chocolate from an American soldier. Other children would see that the first child didn't die, didn't get sick, seemed happier than they'd been in years. They would approach the Americans themselves. Parents, seeing their children fed for the first time in months, would feel their hatred wavering. How could you maintain ideological purity when your child was starving and the enemy was feeding them? Lieutenant James Patterson from Michigan wrote in his diary, "The strangest thing about occupying these towns is the children. At first they run from us, hide, peer at us from behind their mother's skirts. Then one brave kid will approach, and we'll give them whatever we have, gum, chocolate, sometimes just crackers. Within an hour, we're surrounded by kids. They teach us German words. We teach them English. They laugh at our pronunciation. We laugh at theirs. It's hard to remember we're occupying a defeated enemy when you're playing catch with 8-year-olds using a ball made from wrapped candy wrappers." The chocolate and gum served as a wedge that split apart the Nazi narrative. Every piece of candy was proof that the propaganda had been lying. If Americans were monsters, why did they share their rations with enemy children? If they were barbarians, why did they play games and make funny faces to get scared kids to laugh? If they were there to destroy German culture, why did they seem more interested in teaching kids to blow bubble gum bubbles? Support this work so the truth continues to reach people, and subscribe if you haven't yet. The impact went beyond individual encounters. Word spread through German communities like wildfire. In one town, Americans had given out chocolate. In another, they'd shared their rations with hungry families. GIs were teaching German kids to play baseball with makeshift equipment. American medics were treating sick German children, using precious medical supplies on the enemy's youth. The Nazi leadership watched helplessly as their carefully constructed narrative crumbled one Hershey bar at a time. A secret SS report from April 1945, discovered after the war, noted, "The American practice of distributing confectionery to German children is having a catastrophic effect on morale and ideological discipline. Children are actively fraternizing with enemy forces. Parents are failing to enforce racial and political separation. The population is beginning to view Americans as liberators rather than conquerors. Recommend extreme measures to counter this threat. But what extreme measures could counter kindness? How do you fight an enemy that conquers with chocolate? The SS tried. They executed several German civilians for collaboration that consisted of allowing their children to accept American candy. They spread increasingly desperate propaganda about long-term American plans to destroy Germany through kindness before revealing their true nature. But it was too late. The children had tasted chocolate. They had felt kindness from the supposed enemy. The spell was broken. 10-year-old Hans Müller, who would later become a historian, remembered. I had been in the Hitler Youth. I had sworn oaths. I believed everything they told us about Americans. Then one day, an American soldier gave me chewing gum. Just handed it to me and smiled. I was terrified, but also curious. I chewed it, and it was wonderful. Sweet and minty and unlike anything I'd ever tasted. But more than the taste, it was the fact that an enemy soldier had simply been nice to me. No demands. No conditions. Just kindness. That single piece of gum did more to destroy my faith in Nazi ideology than all the Allied propaganda combined. The American soldiers themselves were often unaware of the profound impact they were having. They were young men, many barely out of their teens, who had been through hell and found themselves in a destroyed country full of terrified, hungry children. Their response was instinctive, human, apolitical. They shared what they had because that's what you did when you saw hungry kids. Private David Cohen from the Bronx wrote home. You should see these kids, Ma. They're just like the kids back home, except skinnier and sadder. I know we're supposed to hate the Germans, and I do hate what they did, but how can you hate a 6-year-old? So I give them my candy ration. The other guys do the same. Yesterday, we had a whole crowd of kids following us through town like we were the Pied Piper, except instead of a flute, we had Hershey bars. The candy created unexpected connections. Children became informal interpreters, teaching GIs useful German phrases in exchange for gum. They showed soldiers where mines were hidden, where snipers might be, where their parents had hidden food stores. They became bridges between the occupiers and the occupied, all for the price of a candy bar. But it went deeper than mere transaction. The children began to see Americans as individuals, not as the monolithic evil of propaganda. They learned soldiers' names, recognized faces, developed favorites. Some GIs became known as particularly generous with candy. Others were remembered for making the best funny faces or for teaching the best games. The mythological American monster dissolved into Joe from Ohio who always had gum, or Mike from California who could blow the biggest bubbles. German parents faced an impossible dilemma. Everything they had been told, everything they had believed or pretended to believe, said that Americans were the enemy. But the evidence of their own eyes said otherwise. These young men were feeding their children, playing with them, treating them with more kindness than the Nazi state had shown in years. How do you maintain hatred when the enemy is making your child laugh for the first time since the bombs started falling? Frau Elisabeth Schmidt, a mother of 3 in Bavaria, wrote in her diary, I was prepared to hate them. I was prepared to resist. I was prepared for anything except kindness. When the American sergeant gave my youngest daughter chocolate, she smiled. She hadn't smiled in 6 months, not since her father's death notice arrived. How can I hate a man who made my daughter smile? How can I believe the propaganda when I see them sharing their rations with German children who, just weeks ago, were singing songs about killing Americans? The chocolate and gum became symbols of American abundance, but also of American character. The fact that ordinary soldiers carried such luxuries casually, that they could afford to give them away, spoke to a prosperity that Germany had never achieved even at the height of its power. But more importantly, the fact that they chose to share, that their first instinct upon seeing hungry children was to feed them, contradicted everything Germans had been told about American barbarism. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as materialistic, soulless, lacking culture and human feeling. But here were young Americans showing more compassion to German children than the Nazi state ever had. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Either everything they had been told was a lie, or their own eyes were deceiving them. For most Germans, especially the children, the evidence of their senses won. The impact on American soldiers was equally profound. Many had entered Germany full of hatred, having seen concentration camps, having lost friends to German bullets. But it's hard to maintain hatred when you're surrounded by hungry children. The simple act of giving candy humanized both the giver and the receiver. Corporal Thomas Anderson from Texas recalled, "I went into Germany wanting revenge. My brother died in Normandy. I hated every German. Then I met this kid, couldn't have been more than 5. He was just standing there in the ruins of his house, holding a dead cat. I don't know why, but I gave him my chocolate ration. He looked at me like I'd handed him gold. He said something in German I didn't understand, but his eyes said everything. That's when I realized, he didn't kill my brother. He was just a hungry kid. The war was over for me in that moment." The distribution of candy became so widespread that it became semi-official policy. While never formally ordered, commanders recognized the strategic value of winning hearts and minds through chocolate. Supply officers began setting aside portions of candy rations specifically for distribution to children. Some units organized formal distributions, turning them into events that drew entire communities. The 82nd Airborne Division, occupying parts of Berlin, became famous for their candy bombers, not aircraft, but soldiers who would walk through neighborhoods distributing sweets. They would announce their coming with whistles or songs, and children would emerge from rubble and ruins, forming lines, waiting patiently for their piece of chocolate or stick of gum. These scenes, captured in photographs, showed a different kind of victory, not the conquest of territory but the conquest of hearts. But perhaps the most famous candy story of the occupation was the Berlin Airlift's Little Vittles operation. Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, moved by the sight of German children watching planes land at Tempelhof Airport, began dropping candy attached to handkerchief parachutes from his plane. What started as one pilot's gesture became an operation that dropped over 23 tons of candy to Berlin's children. The same planes that had dropped bombs now dropped chocolate. The symbolism was lost on no one. The Nazi propaganda machine made one last desperate attempt to counter the candy offensive. In the final weeks of the war, they spread rumors that the Americans were only being kind to children to make the eventual betrayal more painful. That the chocolate was a trick to make Germans soft before the real occupation began. That accepting American kindness was a form of racial betrayal that would be punished when the Reich inevitably returned. But the Reich didn't return. The chocolate kept coming. And day by day, child by child, candy bar by candy bar, 12 years of propaganda dissolved like sugar in rain. The testimonies of German children from this period, collected decades later, show the profound psychological impact of these encounters. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, who was 8 in 1945, became a psychologist specializing in propaganda and its effects. She recalled, "The chocolate was more than food. It was proof that we had been lied to. Every sweet taste was evidence that the world was not what we had been told. It created a crisis of belief that went far beyond ideology. If they had lied about Americans being monsters, what else had they lied about? That piece of chocolate started an unraveling that continued for years." Klaus Weber, who was 6 when Americans entered his village, remembered, "The Hitler Youth leader had told us Americans would eat German children. I was terrified when I saw my first American soldier. He was huge, carrying a rifle, covered in dust. Then he knelt down, pulled out a pack of chewing gum, and offered it to me with the gentlest smile. I was so confused I started crying. He thought he'd scared me and tried to comfort me, making funny faces until I laughed. This monster who was supposed to eat me was trying to make me laugh. That's when I understood that everything I'd been taught was a lie." The long-term effects were generational. Children who received chocolate from American soldiers grew up with a fundamentally different view of America than the Nazi generation before them. They became the foundation of post-war German-American friendship. Many would later emigrate to America, study in American universities, or work for American companies. When asked why they felt such affinity for America, many would mention that first piece of chocolate, that first stick of gum. Subscribe so these forbidden stories never vanish again. But there were also painful complexities. Some children were punished by their families for accepting American candy. Others were ostracized by communities still clinging to Nazi ideology. The candy became a dividing line between those ready to accept defeat and those still fighting a lost war in their minds. Anna Braun, interviewed in 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, recalled, "My father forbade us from taking American chocolate. He said it was a betrayal of everything German. But we were so hungry, and the Americans were so kind. My brother and I would sneak out to where the Americans were, and they would give us candy. One day my father caught us. He beat us terribly. But the next day, we went back. The hunger was stronger than the fear, and the kindness was stronger than the hatred." The American soldiers, for their part, were often deeply moved by these interactions. Many had entered Germany prepared to hate, seeking revenge for friends lost, for atrocities discovered. But children have a way of breaking through hatred. The simple act of sharing candy became a form of healing for both sides. Sergeant William Murphy from Boston wrote to his wife, "I've seen terrible things in this war. Things that made me question humanity itself. But yesterday, I gave a little German girl a chocolate bar and she hugged my leg and wouldn't let go. Her mother was crying, saying Danke, Danke over and over. I realized then that most of these people are victims too. The children especially. They didn't choose this war. They didn't choose the Nazis. They're just kids who want what all kids want, to be safe, to be fed, to be loved. If a chocolate bar can give them a moment of happiness in all this destruction, then that's the least I can do." The chocolate and gum served another purpose. They were conversation starters that broke down language barriers. Children learned their first English words. Please, thank you, chocolate, gum. American soldiers learned German. Schokolade, Kaugummi, Kinder. These simple exchanges created human connections that politics and propaganda had tried to prevent. The impact extended to German adults who witnessed these scenes. Fathers who had fought against Americans watched their children playing with American soldiers. Mothers who had been told Americans would rape and pillage saw them sharing their rations with German families. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming and transformative. Heinrich Müller, a former Wehrmacht officer, wrote in his memoirs, "I had fought Americans in France. I had been taught to see them as enemies of German civilization. Then I watched an American sergeant teaching my son to play baseball with a chocolate bar as the prize. My son was laughing. The American was laughing. Other children were gathering to play. I stood there, a defeated soldier watching the enemy play with my child, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Hope that maybe the world after this war wouldn't be the nightmare we'd been promised." The candy distribution revealed something profound about American society and military culture. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, American soldiers had significant personal autonomy. They could choose to share their rations. They could interact with civilians. This flexibility, this humanity within the military structure, was itself a form of propaganda more powerful than any poster or broadcast. German children began to associate Americans not with the destruction of war but with moments of joy amidst the ruins. The same army that had bombed their cities was now bringing sweetness to their lives. This paradox broke the simple narratives of good and evil that propaganda requires. The world became more complex, more nuanced, more human. The chocolate also served as a gateway to larger changes. Children who accepted candy were more likely to attend schools set up by Americans, to participate in denazification programs, to embrace democratic values. The simple act of accepting kindness from the enemy was the first step in accepting that the enemy might not be the enemy after all. By the summer of 1945, the transformation was complete in many areas. German children would run toward American patrols rather than away from them. They would gather at American bases, not to protest but to play, to beg for candy, to practice their English. Parents who months earlier would have died rather than let their children near Americans were now sending them to American-run schools and youth programs. The Nazi propaganda ministry, in its final reports before the complete collapse, acknowledged defeat in what they called the Chocolate War. A report dated April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's suicide, stated, "American distribution of confectionery to German children has completely undermined 12 years of racial and ideological education. The population, especially the youth, no longer views Americans as enemies. This represents a complete failure of the propaganda apparatus." The failure was indeed complete. Years of carefully crafted hatred, of meticulously constructed fear, of scientifically designed propaganda, had been undone by the simple human gesture of giving candy to hungry children. The mighty propaganda machine of the Third Reich, which had moved nations and started wars, had been defeated by Hershey bars and Wrigley's gum. The stories multiplied and spread. Every German family had a chocolate story. Every village had its tale of the kind American who gave out candy. These stories became part of the mythology of the occupation, repeated and embellished, but always with the same core truth: the Americans had been kind when they could have been cruel. Lisa Becker, who was 7 in 1945, remembered, "We had a game where we would try to guess which American soldiers had candy. We became experts at reading their faces, their body language. The ones who smiled when they saw us usually had something. We would follow them like little ducklings, practicing our few words of English, 'Please, Mr. Chocolate?' Most of the time, it worked. They couldn't resist us." The impact on American military doctrine was lasting. The success of the chocolate diplomacy influenced occupation policies in Japan, Korea, and later conflicts. The lesson was clear: winning hearts and minds through small acts of kindness could be more effective than force or formal propaganda. The candy given to German children in 1945 became a template for civil affairs operations that continues to this day. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the German children themselves, who grew up to become the leaders of a democratic Germany allied with the United States. Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who was 15 in 1945, often spoke of his first encounter with Americans and how it shaped his worldview. Many of the architects of post-war German-American cooperation were children who had received chocolate from GIs. The last word belongs to Joseph Madden, the private from Brooklyn who gave that first chocolate bar we mentioned. Interviewed in 2005, 60 years after the war, he said, "I never thought much about it at the time. The kid was hungry. I had chocolate. It seemed like the obvious thing to do. But years later I got a letter. It was from that boy, now a grandfather. He'd tracked me down somehow. He wrote that the chocolate bar changed his life, made him realize that enemies could become friends, that kindness could exist even in war. He became a teacher and spent his career teaching German children about America, about democracy, about friendship between nations. All from one chocolate bar. Makes you think about the power of small gestures." The ruins of 1945 are gone now, rebuilt into modern German cities. The children who received chocolate from American soldiers are grandparents and great-grandparents. But the memory remains, passed down through generations, the memory of when the enemy came not with hatred but with Hershey bars, not with vengeance but with chewing gum. In museums across Germany, you can find displays about the occupation that include wrappers from American candy, carefully preserved for 75 years. They're treated as historical artifacts, which they are, artifacts of a moment when human kindness triumphed over propaganda, when chocolate defeated hatred, when the simple act of giving candy to children changed the course of nations. The propaganda of the Third Reich lies buried in history's dustbin, its lies exposed, its hatred rejected. But the memory of American soldiers sharing chocolate with German children lives on, proof that in the darkest moments of human history, small acts of kindness can shine like stars, breaking through the walls of propaganda and fear to reveal the common humanity that connects us all. What breaks first, a wall of lies, or the hunger of a child? In Germany, in 1945, the answer came wrapped in foil, sweet on the tongue, delivered by young men who understood instinctively what all the propagandists had forgotten: that kindness is the most powerful weapon of all, and chocolate can conquer what armies cannot: the human heart. In the ruins of empires, sometimes history does turn on the small things: a smile, a wrapper, the taste of sweetness in the ashes of war. The American soldiers who gave German children gum and chocolate didn't just feed hungry mouths. They destroyed a worldview, demolished a carefully constructed hatred, and built in its place something stronger than any propaganda: the simple, unshakable truth that enemies can become friends, that kindness can bloom in the rubble of war, and that sometimes, just sometimes, a piece of candy can change the world.